This is BBC World News. I'm Matthew Amroliwala. On today's Global, a desperate need for humanitarian aid in Afghanistan. There's a looming catastrophe, according to the United Nations, with 14 million people marching towards starvation.
Let's separate the people who are going hungry from the political situation and whoever happens to be in power at the time.
The estimate to avoid disaster, $600 million immediately. But will the world be willing to help a country run by the Taliban?
And I'm Lise Doucette in Kabul, where I'll be asking Afghanistan's health minister how he plans to feed and care for his people.
Later in Global, we have a special report on atrocities by the Taliban against civilians in Panjshir province. We'll also talk exclusively to the former Minister for Women's Affairs. Also ahead here, a huge potential breakthrough on cancer, the blood test that could detect the disease before symptoms even appear. And just days after her father said he was giving up his control over her life, Britney Spears announces she's become engaged. Hello and welcome back to Global. The programme is returning to air for the first time since the coronavirus pandemic. All the important news of the day in one place with me, Matthew Amroliwala. Well, we turn first to Afghanistan, where the scale of the task is mammoth, according to the United Nations. After 4 decades of war, a year-long drought and COVID-19, half the population is in need of help. The UN is currently meeting in Geneva and New York in the hope of raising $600 million of emergency aid after the Taliban's return to power. Lisa,
we'll continue our special coverage, but that's all from us.
Lisa, fascinating interview. Thanks very much, Lise Doucette, live for us there in Kabul. Now to other news, and the world's biggest trial of a blood test that can detect more than 50 types of cancer before symptoms even appear is getting underway in Britain. It searches for DNA changes in the bloodstream resulting from tumours, and it aims to help early diagnosis of cancers that are hard to identify in their early stages. Here's our health correspondent, Dominic Hughes. Now, do stay with us because still to come on today's Global programme, just days after her father said he was giving up his control over her life, Britney Spears announces she's become engaged. Welcome back to BBC World News. Our main story here, the United Nations is appealing for $600 million in aid for Afghanistan to try to avoid what it says will be a humanitarian catastrophe. Now, a BBC Panorama investigation has uncovered evidence suggesting that one of Britain's biggest companies paid a bribe to the former Zimbabwean dictator Robert Mugabe. British American Tobacco is also accused of paying bribes and using illegal surveillance methods to damage its rivals in South Africa. BAT says its actions have been mischaracterised and insists it's committed to the higher standards of corporate conduct. Here's Richard Bilton. Lisa, thanks very much for taking us through all of that. We're about to take a break. Do stay with us because here in a few minutes' time I'll be speaking to the former Afghan Minister for Women's Affairs, a job that actually no longer exists under the Taliban. That is coming up in the next little while. The latest lines on Afghanistan and that donor conference, the UN Migration Agency, the head saying that the medical system of Afghanistan is on the verge of collapse, and the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, said that more than $1 billion in aid has been pledged for Afghanistan so far during this event, but it was, quote, impossible to know how much was specifically for this UN emergency appeal. They'd originally asked for over $600 million. So that, the latest lines from that donor conference. Don't forget that interview with the former head of the Women's Ministry. That is coming up here in a moment or two. Don't go away. This is BBC World News. I'm Matthew Amroliwala. Our main stories on today's global programme: a desperate need for humanitarian aid in Afghanistan. The United Nations says there's a looming catastrophe with half of all children under 5 facing malnutrition.
Let's separate the people who are going hungry from the political situation and whoever happens to be in power at the time.
Also on Global, what is going on in Afghanistan's Panjshir Valley? The BBC has obtained and verified footage showing civilians being killed by the Taliban. We have a special report. I'll also be speaking to a former Afghan Minister for Women's Affairs, a job which no longer exists under the Taliban. Plus, we have the latest business news here today. We'll look at how the world's shipping industry is planning to cope with a huge spike in demand and pressure to cut down on greenhouse gas emissions. Could tennis sensation Emma Raducanu's amazing rise to the top make her the UK's first billionaire sportswoman? And the wildfires in southern Spain, which have forced thousands of people to flee their homes. Hello and welcome back to the programme. After 4 decades of war, a year-long drought and COVID-19, half the population of Afghanistan is in need of help. The situation is getting desperate, as the Afghan Health Minister, Wahid Majid, has just been explained to us here on today's global programme. Sina Safi, we have to leave it there, but we are very grateful for you talking exclusively to BBC World News. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Now, still to come on today's programme, Aaron will be here with all the business news of the day, including a look at what the Democratic Party plans in America to increase corporation tax, what it could mean there in the US. Welcome back. Let's turn to our main headlines. The United Nations is appealing for $600 million in aid for Afghanistan to try to avoid what it says would be a humanitarian catastrophe. And the BBC has obtained and verified footage which shows civilians being killed by Taliban fighters in Afghanistan's Panjshir Valley. Now it is time for all the day's business news, and Aaron is here, and there are tax rises looming for US companies, aren't there, Aaron?
There sure are. Hey, congratulations on the relaunch.
It's looking lovely, isn't it?
It is. I was going to ask if there was any branding. There actually is a little bit of branding, Maddie. I like it. Thanks very much. Hello there. Yeah, let's head to the States, because the Democrats in the US House of Representatives, they're proposing raising corporate tax to 26.5% from the current level, which is 21%. Let's jump straight over to our very own Michelle Fleury, who's in New York for us. And following this, Michelle, lovely to see you as always. So 26.5%, yes, it's a jump, but it's still short of the 28%, right, that was proposed by President Biden this year. Okay, there you go. Hey, that's it, Maddie. I'll see you tomorrow, mate. I'm going.
I'll see you tomorrow. Thanks very much. Now to that tennis wonder story from the weekend. Emma Raducanu's win at the US Open in New York. It has propelled the 18-year-old into the sporting stratosphere. She's now predicted to become one of the biggest earners in sport. Here's Laura Scott. What an incredible story. Yeah, we're going to take a short break. When we're back, we'll have all the latest on that donor conference the UN is organising. Here in a moment or two. Don't go away. This is BBC World News. I'm Matthew Amroliwala. On today's Global, a desperate need for humanitarian aid in Afghanistan. There's a looming catastrophe, according to the United Nations, with 14 million people marching towards starvation.
Let's separate the people who are going hungry from the political situation and whoever happens to be in power at the time.
The UN says $1 billion has been promised. Afghanistan's health minister, who's not a member of the Taliban, tells us how bad the problems are.
I've tried my best not to only physically stay here, but to act and join forces to to lobby and advocate for the health of those mothers and children.
That interview in full here in just a few minutes' time. Also on Global, a huge trial of a revolutionary new blood test that detects more than 50 types of cancer before the patient has any symptoms. And a court in America is due to hold its first hearing in the sexual assault lawsuit brought against the UK's Prince Andrew. We'll get the latest from our royal correspondent. Hello and welcome to Global. More than $1 billion has been pledged for Afghanistan at a UN emergency aid conference in Geneva. The UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, described the humanitarian crisis facing the Afghan people following the Taliban's return to power as perhaps their most perilous hour. Now to our other headline stories, because the world's biggest trial of a blood test that can detect more than 50 types of cancer before symptoms even appear is getting underway in Britain. It searches for DNA changes in the bloodstream resulting from tumours, and it aims to help early diagnosis of cancers that are hard to identify in their early stages. Well, let's talk now to Dame Callie Palmer, who is NHS England's National Cancer Director. Thank you so much for being here with us on BBC News. That phrase, game changer in medicine, is so overused, but is it right potentially here, do you think? Johnny Diamond talking to me just a little earlier. Now, do stay with us, because still to come on today's programme, just days after her father said he was giving up his control over her life, Britney Spears announces she's become engaged. Welcome back to Global here on BBC World News. Our main story here: the United Nations is appealing for $600 million in aid for Afghanistan to try to avoid what it says would be a humanitarian catastrophe. Now, Israel's Prime Minister Naftali Bennett is having talks with Egypt's president. It is the first official visit to Egypt by an Israeli leader for a decade. Preparations for it were kept secret for security reasons, and the negotiations were only announced just before they actually began. Let's talk to our Middle East correspondent, Yolande Nell. And Yolande, just take us through the significance of what we're seeing being played out here. Lizo Mazimba, just a quick pointer. We're back with Global in half an hour's time, where we'll play you an interview with the UN's High Commissioner for Refugees, Filippo Grandi, who's currently visiting Kabul. That's here in half an hour's time. I'm back with headlines in just a moment or two. See you in a bit. This is BBC World News. Our main headlines here. The United Nations says the international community has promised $1 billion in aid for Afghanistan. UN officials have warned of a humanitarian catastrophe, with children left malnourished unless urgent action is taken. The BBC has obtained and verified footage showing more than 20 people being killed by Taliban fighters in Afghanistan's Panjshir Valley. A Taliban spokesman has denied such killings are taking place. A new blood test which could detect cancer before symptoms even appear is being trialled in the UK. It's hoped the programme could give early warning of up to 50 types of cancer. And Britney Spears says she's become engaged to her longtime boyfriend, Sam Asghari. The announcement comes just days after her father filed in court to end his legal control of his daughter's life.
Global business news from the boardroom or grassroots. Aaron Hesselhurst cuts through the jargon to add colour, depth and context. With live reaction from Wall Street and Asia, studio interviews with top CEOs and the latest innovations in technology. Talking business on BBC World News.
Hello everybody, a very warm welcome to Talking Business Weekly with me, Aaron Hesselhurst. Let's go and take a look at what's on the show. Technology! Oh, it is changing modern life and it's transforming how we work. Artificial intelligence and robotics will see millions of jobs become obsolete, but others will be created as a result. Hey, I'm going to be discussing all of that with these two. There they are, Judith Weiss, who's the Chief HR Officer at Siemens, and Julie Shah, a robotics expert from MIT, about what the future holds and how the humans can adapt to keep up. Also on the show, ride-hailing app Bolt is revved up to take on the competition, but the pandemic put the brakes on the business. The big boss tells me how COVID transformed their offerings. Whether you're joining us from the US, Europe, Africa or Asia, once again a big hello and a very warm welcome to the show. Let's get cracking. You know, warnings that robots are coming for our jobs isn't new, no. You know, in the 1930s, the economist John Maynard Keynes talked of a new disease that he called technological unemployment. In the last couple of decades, the internet, digitization and robotics and artificial intelligence have changed how we work faster than any other time in history. So, how can we keep up in order not to be left behind? We're going to be discussing all of that in a moment. But first, here's a novel solution for smaller companies who don't necessarily have deep pockets. Well, Marcus Willig, the founder and the big boss of Bolt, how I always appreciate your time, mate. Good luck with everything. I'll keep an eye on it and we'll check in with you soon.
Thanks.
Well, that's all for this week. I hope you enjoyed the show. Don't forget, follow me on Twitter. Tweet me. I'll tweet you back. You can get me at BBC Aaron. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.
This is BBC World News. I'm Matthew Amroliwala. On today's Global, a desperate need for humanitarian aid in Afghanistan. There's a looming catastrophe, according to the United Nations, with 14 million people marching towards starvation. But help is being promised.
We already heard clearly more than $1 billion of pledges. It represents a quantum leap in relation to the financial commitment of the international community.
The question now, how will that money be used by Afghanistan's new rulers? The country's health minister, who's not a member of the Taliban, tells us how bad the problems are.
I've tried my best not to only physically stay here, but to act and join forces to lobby and advocate for the health of those mothers and children.
That interview in full here in just a few minutes' time. Also on Global, Britain's Prince Andrew says there is no legal basis for the sexual assault case filed by Virginia Giuffre to be heard in New York. We'll talk live to our correspondent outside the courthouse. And a huge trial of a new revolutionary blood test that detects more than 50 types of cancer before the patient has any symptoms. Hello and welcome to Global. More than $1 billion has been pledged for Afghanistan at a UN emergency aid conference in Geneva. The UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres described the humanitarian crisis facing the Afghan people following the Taliban's return to power as perhaps their most perilous hour. At least a say it with a fascinating interview there. Let's turn to our other headline story, because the world's biggest trial of a blood test that can detect more than 50 types of cancer before symptoms even appear is getting underway in Britain. It's called the Galleri test, and it searches for DNA changes in the bloodstream resulting from tumours. It aims to help early diagnosis of cancers that are hard to identify in their early stages. Well, Professor Charles Swanton is a clinical scientist and co-chief investigator on this NHS trial. Thank you so much for talking to us here on the BBC. I was talking an hour or so ago to the NHS cancer director, who described it as a potential game changer. How excited are you by this? Yolande Nell. Now, still to come on today's Global. Just days after her father said he was giving up his control over her life, Britney Spears announces she's become engaged. Welcome back to Global here on BBC World News. Our main stories: the United Nations says more than $1 billion of aid have been promised for Afghanistan. Funding, it says, needs to avoid a humanitarian catastrophe. A new blood test which could detect cancer before symptoms even appear is being trialled in the UK. Now, a court in New York is due to hold a pre-trial hearing in the civil case filed by a woman who claims Prince Andrew sexually assaulted her when she was 17. Last week, lawyers for Virginia Giuffre claimed they had successfully served Prince Andrew with legal papers. Prince Andrew has always denied the allegations and says he has no recollection of meeting Virginia Giuffre. Well, let's head live to New York, and our correspondent Neda Tawfik, who's following this story for us. And Neda, tell us the latest that you are hearing from Prince Andrew's legal team. Quick reminder of our main story: Antonio Guterres saying that $1 billion raised at the donor conference represents a quantum leap in the international commitment from the international community to Afghanistan. That's it from today's programme. Thanks very much for watching, and I hope you've enjoyed the return of Global. See you again tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Hello there. We've got some wet weather moving into Portugal and western areas of Spain.